We're going to kick off the conference with a great keynote speaker. I want to start by saying there are a number of words that can describe what's happening now. Unprecedented, historic, tumultuous, baffling. They describe the international trade landscape in the last 5.5 months. But we're indeed fortunate to have Andrew Staples with us to launch this conference and help us navigate this ever-changing reality. Or is it a car wreck? I'm not sure. But Dr. Staples is the founder and principal of GeoPol Asia, a boutique advisory service operating at the intersection of geopolitics, business, and strategy. Andrew established GeoPol Asia in 2024, following a career spanning 3 decades in Asia. He is an expert at connecting the dots between geopolitics and economics, something that we all need to be able to do these days. Andrew was previously the editorial director and head of policy and insights at The Economist Impact. He led a team of researchers and analysts and editors across Asia. He was formerly the global editorial director of The Economist Corporate Network, The Economist Intelligence Unit's briefing and advisory service designed to help senior business leaders understand and navigate the complex business environments. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Staples.
Thank you, Kevin. Is this okay? Not too loud? Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you today. It's a real pleasure to do so, and thank you also to the Hinrich Foundation for hosting. I'm actually a member of the advisory board at the Hinrich Foundation, so it's a great pleasure to be able to contribute to the work that they do here today. Is that on? Scott, I can speak quite loudly anyway without this, so if it does go, I'll just take it off. But listen, I'm here just to share some thoughts. I think some big picture thoughts at the outset of your session here over the next 2-3 days. All of the things that that Chuan Wei was just talking about and Kevin was referencing to, I'll touch on at some degree, but the other speakers that you've got over the next couple of days are going to go into much more sort of depth and detail. So just imagine that I'm providing the sort of canvas or mapping out the sort of canvas around geopolitics, and that you'll go into in a bit more fine detail with others a little bit later on over the next couple of days. I've got a load of slides. I might go over them. It depends how much time we've got, but I do want to leave a bit of time for some sort of discussion and Q&A as we get towards the end. Just a very brief resume up there. I've been in the region on and off. In fact, I first came out to Asia in 1988. I'm from the UK originally. I came out with a backpack to Hong Kong. Anybody from Hong Kong? Okay, I stayed in Chungking Mansions for about 3 months. It's a dreadful flop house, but I stayed in Madam Ying's guest house for about 3 months. It was fantastic. My first introduction to Asia, I come from the southwest of England. Bath is my hometown. It's a very nice, small town, and then you end up in the heart of Hong Kong with all the noise and activity and everything like that. And I got completely fell in love with this part of the world. I then spent about 15 years on and off in Japan and nearly 10 years here in Singapore. I had an academic career, really looking at business and economics in Asia, but my PhD was all around Japanese foreign direct investment in Asia, looking at the context of regionalism and so on. I was very interested in the idea of, understanding why firms go overseas, why they engage in foreign direct investment, particularly Japanese firms, and not just from the sort of business side of that, what pushes a company overseas, what sort of competitive advantages do they have that allow them to operate overseas, for example, but the political aspects of it as well. Just to give you a very quick example, I studied the auto sector. So if you think about Japanese auto sector FDI in Thailand, it's been massive over decades, employs hundreds of thousands of people. The supply chain is very, very deep. And that gives Japan a certain sort of political influence in Thailand as well. Some of this being challenged at the moment by China. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. So anyway, foreign direct investment, but really a sort of political economy approach to that. So states, non-state actors, i.e. multinationals, how they all sort of interact in foreign direct investment, and of course trade as well, because the point of going overseas is you're making stuff for the domestic market, but you're exporting out as well. So trade, FDI, really two sides of the same coin. In 2013, I joined The Economist. So I came out of an academic career where I was researching and lecturing at business schools and graduate schools and all the rest of it, to join The Economist Intelligence Unit, to work much more closely with C-suite of multinationals, largely European, North American headquartered firms, some Japanese, some Australian and so on, in Tokyo, and then here in Southeast Asia. And then during COVID, I had the great opportunity to join the Hinrich Foundation, actually, as their Director of Research and Outreach. I was here for just under a year as the centre got up to speed. My office was just view there, and the view every morning was just absolutely fantastic. So I've been knowledgeable of the Hinrich Foundation, the work they do for a number of years. Rejoined The Economist to head up their research-led thought leadership and engagement part of the business for a number of years, until last year, and I came out and set up my own advisory around geopolitics. So again, working with C-suite boards of multinationals, helping them to understand and navigate what's going on in the world to the best that I possibly can. Okay, so that's me. Let me just sort of have a look at our agenda today. So really sort of three areas, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this first one, on this sort of context, providing that sort of shared understanding from my perspective. It might be quite different from yours or somebody else's, but this is very much my perspective of some of the issues that Chu In-wei was just talking about, those assumptions that have underpinned globalization and what's changed and what might be coming down the pipe that we all need to be dealing with. So this idea of what's next for globalization, what does that look like in the years and decades going forward from here? And what is this sort of idea of this emerging new world order? What does that look like? What does all of this mean for trade, foreign direct investment, international relations, and so on? And then I want to bring the focus into here on the Indo-Pacific a little bit, to think about how these sort of contours of the emerging new world order, of how new globalization might emerge, how they touch down in this part of the world, and then finally just a bit of a look ahead. Okay, so let's jump in with all of this. And if we've just got to put these sort of terms of reference up here, so we've got a sort of common understanding. If you want to think about globalization, well, there it is. You've got container ships going back and forth through the Straits. You've got Changi Airport, people flying in from all over the world. You've got the financial sector here. And just a bit hazy today, but if you looked a bit further out, you'll see Indonesia, which economically might be sort of 30, 40 years behind Singapore, and different models of economic development that we see over here, and Malaysia just next door as well. But globalization, I really take to sort of mean that deepening integration of the global economy through trade and investment. Flows of money, of goods, of capital, of people, increasingly of data, and so on. So you can think of it as a sort of the veins of the global economy, things moving around. And we've all benefited from this for many decades. Geopolitics, you've been hearing a lot of recently, and one of the reasons you've been hearing a lot about geopolitics is because we are in this period of flux. I think for many years, if you particularly go back to the 1990s, early 2000s, you didn't really need to worry so much about geopolitics, particularly as it pertained to trade and foreign direct investment. Now you do. It's really come to the sort of front of mind of thinking. It's at the top of the agenda. And again, I'm not sure how familiar people are with the term geo-economics, but again, the geo aspect of that, the geography aspect of it, but the economic tools that are increasingly being used in the global political economy. You could be thinking about tariffs, would be a great example, import restrictions, export restrictions, and so on and so on, using economic tools to achieve political aims. There's a final sort of term up there, power, which I think is central to understanding or trying to get an understanding of what's going on. I'm a student of international political economy, right? How states interact, the role of non-state actors within that as well. But the essential question for international political economy is power. Who has it, and what are they going to do with it? And I think if you keep some of these ideas in your thinking as we go through, see how they, or pose yourself some questions. Who has power here? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? What are the geo-economic tools that countries are increasingly resorting to? And what does that mean to businesses as they try to navigate this increasingly politicized and complex environment? Anyway, just some terms of reference for you. So I'm just going to put this up and go through a few slides on this sort of point. Globalization in a specific historical context. And you could go all the way back to the end of the Second World War, 1945, general agreement on tariff and trade, Bretton Woods institutions and so on. But really I'm going to focus a bit more on the sort of 1990s onwards, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union up until quite recently. But anyway, let's have a look at some of these economic, political, geopolitical assumptions that have been the foundations of globalization during that period. So we just mentioned this one, this idea of, we've had the Second World War, massive global conflagration, touched every sort of corner of the world, and out of that, we see that the United States emerges as the world's strongest economy. The baton sort of passed over from the United Kingdom, which has essentially gone bankrupt after 2 world wars, with massive debt to the United States, and so on. Empire starts to get dismantled and all the rest of it. End of the Second World War, right the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's the Bretton Woods, or the hotel where the Bretton Woods institutions were hashed out. And they've really underpinned a lot of the world. I mentioned global agreement on tariffs of trade, but you could be thinking about ultimately that turned into the WTO, IMF, World Bank, all of these sort of Western-led institutions that have been fundamental to globalization. And then you come right up to 1989. You can tell it's 1989 by the really bad sort of hairdos and clothes that the Germans are wearing there. But anyway, this is everything that was going on around the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that sort of period from 1945, the Cold War, some places very hot, not least in Vietnam, Cuban Missile Crisis and all the rest of it. But anyway, that Cold War period, right up until the end of 89, sort of 90, the Soviet Union collapses. A lot of the issues we've got today in Eastern Europe with Russia, with Ukraine, the Baltic states and so on, directly go back to the end of the Soviet Union. But that's as an aside. And we get into this sort of period that, we've had the Cold War, we've had these competing models for sort of social organization, Western market, democracies and liberalism and all the rest of it, and state directed economies, control economies and so on, exemplified by the Soviet Union. That didn't work. The West won. And you get this idea that we've come to the sort of the end of history. This is how we should be organizing. Everybody else wants to become an open sort of market liberal economy. And in that period, of course, we've seen in this part of the world, the East Asian miracle. Japan rebuilds after the Second World War under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, focuses on economic development. We see that rapid economic growth all the way through the 60s into the 70s, that then comes to a bit of a screeching halt around 1990. But anyway, and then South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and then in more recent years, China, and of course, India now, the biggest, fastest growing large economy in the world. 1.3 billion people growing at 6-7%, has overtaken China, has the sort of crown there as well. But in this period, all of these assumptions there, comparative advantage, as we were hearing on. I joined The Economist. If I don't know if you know, The Economist Group was established in 1843, primarily to argue for free trade. And that was the founding principle of the Economist Group, and they've been doing that for the past 180 years or so. But free trade, you make this thing, we trade it, we ship it around the world, whatever it is, makes sense, everybody benefits. This goes all the way back to sort of classic economics and so on. We see a big push on liberalization, and particularly around trade. Tariffs, the trade come down and down and down through things like the WTO, the negotiation of multilateral rounds, some bilaterals and all the rest of it. And as tariffs come down, trade dramatically increases. And the world as a whole gets more and more prosperous, not least in this part of the world. So opening up your economy, if you want to trade in this system, you need to open up your economy. You need to let foreign firms come in and sell and buy and set up factories or whatever. And we all sort of get a bit more closely interlinked through these activities. And all of this creates a lot of sort of rationale for global supply chains. And we've seen this. A great book, if you haven't read it, strongly recommend it, Chip Wars by Chris Miller. In there's a few sort of chapters that document the globalization of tech supply chains, from America. Texas Instruments, I think, the first sort of big American tech firm to move into Hong Kong, cheaper labor, splitting out that value chain of how you make something, putting a bit here, putting a bit there, and linking it all together through, cargo and freight and airplanes and all the rest of it, because it makes sense. Let's put all of the semiconductors over here, but let's put, screwing things together over here because of the economics of it. So, efficiency, globally efficient supply chains over resilience, and we come back to it a bit later on. It's the other way around now. We're talking about resilience over efficiency. Well, why is that? But anyway, we're talking about this period, particularly in the sort of 80s and 90s. In terms of the regulatory framework, GATT becomes WTO. We have countries around the world sitting down together, hammering out the next deal, how they're going to reduce barriers to trade, increase access to their markets, and so on. Everything focused on this sort of multilateral approach, right? We all come together, we all join the club, we all agree together to lower our barriers. I'm being very simplistic here, but essentially we all benefit from that. And one of the other sort of assumptions we get there is that, you see a lot of this in the writing, that, we've sort of gone out of the world wars, we've had the Cold War, we're into this period now where, why would we go to war? We're all trading and investing in each other. So peace actually comes from economic interdependence. And yes, I mentioned this already, Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and The Last Man, published in, I think, early 1990s, but essentially saying this model of multilateralism, of Western-led sort of liberalization, market economies and so on, has won out. Go back and read it. Some of it's a bit dated now, but he's still very active at writing. I strongly recommend your research to him. But anyway, this was the period of a US-led global order. And we're in the sort of period that globalization sort of trumps nationalism, I should say, as well. So that was then, right? And particularly thinking about that 1990 period up until, let's say, maybe 2008, global financial crisis, where things start to sort of not fall apart, but become questioned and challenged, and we see alternative models being promoted and so on, which I think really sort of marks the start of this emerging New World Order. So I'm saying here that these assumptions are breaking down. And why is that? It seems to have worked very well. The economies have got richer, people have trade, we can buy stuff from all over the world, whatever it is, it's worked. So why not continue with it? Why is it breaking down? I think a number of things here: inequality, populism, discontent with how the global economy has been set up, people feeling that they haven't benefited from this as well. Climate change, another major issue to deal with. But this picture here, this isn't recent. This is from, I think, 1999 in Seattle when the WTO were meeting. There were big riots on the street, people pushing back, saying, WTO equals big business. It's killing us. It's killing the economy. You get this sort of backlash growing against that US-led multilateralism and so on. You can see on here, WTO, IMF, NAFTA, World Bank. No, we don't want it. So, there's a very famous book at this time, Globalization and its Discontents as well. So, sort of growing, everything's not quite right. And if you were to go into the former northern industrial towns of the UK, where they used to do coal mining, shipbuilding, steel manufacturing, and so on, all of those jobs were gone. Many of those economies and societies were decimated, still are. High unemployment, very bad health outcome, low education, and all the rest of it. And those jobs, at that time, many of them would have been disappearing to places like Asia, shipbuilding, Japan, South Korea, China, for example. And this breeds a bit of anger, a bit of discontent, people feeling that they're not invested, they're not benefiting from globalization. We've also seen a rise in alternative ways of organizing your society, your economy. Not that just sort of one size fits all, which it never was, but anyway, market, democratic, liberal economies that, worked very, very well. Everybody has their own sort of interpretation of that. So Japan is a capitalist society, but quite different to the United States. And the United States is very different to, say, Germany or France or Singapore or whatever it might be. But they're still all within the same sort of ballpark, right? But then you start getting models that have been developed outside of that. I'm thinking particularly places like China, for example. But all throughout this period, and up until now, we just had another G7 in Canada, or G6 in a bit, as Trump left very early. But anyway, look at the flags of those countries that are essentially the most important economies, the ones that are sort of setting the rules of the road, determining how the global economy is organized and run. So that's the G7. But more recently, we've seen the rise of the so-called global south, BRICS economies. That massive growth of the Chinese economy from the 1980s onwards, but particularly from 2001 when it joined the WTO, really turbocharged Chinese growth there. We'll come back to that in a moment because it's front and center in thinking about the tariff regime and Make America First policy and so on, and how that's informed by that experience. But you've got others there. Russia. What happened to Russia throughout the 1990s into the early 2000s. You've got the rise of India now and other global south economies. So actually these economies are saying, well, hold on a minute, we're actually quite big and important. We're growing as well. We've got bigger populations. We're contributing more to global growth and so on. We want to actually have a say in how the world is run, not just you guys at the G7 and so on. So, these are some of the dynamics that are shaping the world at the moment. Just have a look at this. This is the BRICS, and really the sort of question here is who gets to set the rules of the road. When I mean that, how we trade, how money is moved around, the regulatory regime. How's your data governed and digital trade and all the rest of it? Who gets to set the rules of the road? Who has power to influence all of that is increasingly a central question. So the BRICS have been going a bit overplayed, I would say, at the moment. But if you look into the future, and if you look at the sort of projected growth of non-G7 economies, then you can certainly see that this is in the post. We would assume, all things being equal, China continues to grow. It will moderate. Maybe next year it'll be 4% growth or whatever. But that's the world's second biggest economy, growing at 4%. India, 6-7% should be easily achieving that in coming years as well. I already mentioned that's the world's largest economy in terms of population. All of this compounded over these years mean that the non-G7 countries will become more economically important, will have more weight than the G7 in coming years. So of course this creates a push for greater representation. We want to do things this way, not your way. Why should we have to follow these rules? Why should we have the European Union telling us all about sort of labour conditions and so on in this part of the world? So all of these questions come into sort of closer scrutiny. We've also had growing US-China tensions, and this is not necessarily anything new. Remember, successive Democrat and Republican presidents were promoting China. China's going to grow. It's going to become more like us. It's going to become more open. Let's help it grow and support. It worked well with Japan and South Korea and all the rest of it. It can work with China as well. Until it's sort of the growing recognition that actually that's not the trajectory that China is going to take, that they're going to be taking their own course. And just to sort of, talk through that picture there, I don't know if you recall, but that was Obama's last trip to China, where there was a big sort of diplomatic thing about the stair didn't come up to the door of the plane, and he had to come out the backside of Air Force One, which was seen as a sort of calculated snub to Obama. So that's back then, and then we get this sort of idea that the West has got their assumptions about China wrong. It's not going to become more like us. It's not going to become a liberal market democracy. In fact, particularly dating back to when Xi Jinping takes control, taking a hard swerve to the left, doubling down on a sort of a hard state, a Leninist sort of state there, coupled with the capitalist model, access to markets and all the rest of it. And you have the bizarre spectacle in 2016 of Xi Jinping in Davos, talking to the world's great and good about how China is going to be underpinning the WTO. China is the stable partner for everybody in the world. Exactly the same type of speech that we hear at the moment as well. And 2016 is the year that Britain voted to come out the European Union, Brexit, and it's also the year that President Trump was elected for the first time as well. So there seems to be this sort of divergence. Those cheerleaders of globalization, of Western-style globalization, the UK and America, seem to be turning inwards, or seem to be turning their back a little bit on their role in terms of supporting and maintaining the global order that we've had for all of those years, and other actors are coming in. And then, this is a picture at the whatever meeting that was G20 in Osaka in 2019. The splits between China and the United States getting more and more pronounced. The relationship really going into the deep freeze. And essentially, what was it, last month, we saw pretty much a sort of embargo on trade between the US and China. Military tensions, security tensions, battles around technology for influence, all this type of stuff. This relationship between the US and China, really fundamental to understanding the global political economy. I've also talked a little bit about sort of populism and so on, but this has given rise to more nationalism and a nationalist backlash. You see some of the standard bearers there. There's Putin, there's Mr. Trump in the middle, there's Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage's Reform Party, which used to be the Brexit Party, by some measures is now the second most important political party in the UK. Could become a kingmaker in the next election, which is way off. But anyway, gives you an idea. Marie Le Pen, not far behind them as well. Again, globalization hasn't worked. It's global elites who are enriching themselves. We're not benefiting. And if I'm a nationalist leader, I can pick up the playbook and say, oh yes, it's not your fault. It's somebody else's fault. Vote for me, give me power, and everything will be fine. I'll put tariffs over here. I'll kick the foreigners out of our country, or whatever it might be. Quite a harder, nasty edge to some of this nationalism that we've seen around the world. And then, of course, we've just come into the second Trump presidency. And from the sort of get-go, I mean, talking about sort of how long this has felt, it's what, 5 months? It does feel much longer because the pace, the cadence of activities is just unrelenting. Literally every morning, you're waking up, you're having a look on your phone, opening your laptop, and something else has happened. Tariffs on steel have gone from 25 to 50%, or Iran has been bombed with bunker busters and whatever it might be. What is it tomorrow? What is it the next day? And so on. So, things have really sort of got to this boiling point, which is why geopolitics, geo-economics have come right to the sort of front again. And we get this idea that, taking together, we're looking at the emergence, the birthing of a new world order. The old one hasn't fallen apart quite yet, but it's looking a bit ropey. Some things aren't working very well. The United Nations Security Council is a bit of a joke. It can't function. The WTO is not functioning. Things are not working. Something new needs to come in its place. And who's going to be shaping that? Who's got the power to push all of that through? So, this is where we are. Just some examples from Economist covers over the last couple of years, and that's foreign affairs from earlier on this year as well. So if we're thinking that, there is some kind of new world order emerging, what is it going to look like? What are the contours or features of this new world order? What does that mean for globalization? And again, if you look at all of those measures of globalization, foreign direct investment flows, you'd be thinking about trade. Well before the global financial crisis, global trade would generally grow at twice the rate of global GDP. That relationship is completely, broken down again. Things like tariffs, of course, not helping there. So, what does the new phase of globalization look like? So let's give some little bit of thought to that. I'm going to break it down into sort of 6 different areas. Geopolitically, transitioning to a multipolar world. I think you have Parag Khanna in next day or so coming into the team. He's really, really good on this. So, you're in for a treat listening to him about this transition to a multipolar world. But again, what does that look like? Rather than the US or the G7 holding all the power, setting the rules of the road, it's China, it's India, it's the global south, the European Union. Anyway, it's much more dispersed, a multipolar world, not the unipolar world that underpinned globalization before. Are we moving into a new Cold War era? Well, there's some some reasons you could say, yeah, it does look like a bit more, security, tensions, all the rest of it, but it's not as clear cut. The Soviet Union was simply not part of Western economic models. It was insignificant. China is deeply embedded into the global trading system. It's impossible for us to, think about the global economy without China, for example. And then some people also, more pessimistically say, actually, we're in a bit of a pre-war period. If anybody sort of studies international relations, you'll see that all of the studies, when one system gives way to another one, invariably there's going to be some kinetic energy around all of that. So, and where might that be? Well, we're actually already seeing it, aren't we? We're seeing some of this in Europe, the Middle East. There's a big arc. India, Pakistan just had a crack at each other a couple of weeks ago. And as we come on to a little bit later on, no shortage of geopolitical flashpoints in this part of the world as well. So, there's a sort of cloud hanging over us. This could easily tip into something very nasty. Geoeconomics, as I've mentioned, has really sort of come to the fore again. And what do we mean by geoeconomics? A real focus on economic security. And you see this time and again in executive orders, for example, stressing that the trade regime, an inward investment regime for the United States, is fundamentally about economic security. So in practice, that means that, this massive over-reliance on China for rare earths and so on is unacceptable. That's an unacceptable dependence. It's something that the United States really wants to deal with. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But it might also be thinking about shipping or where your supply chains are, who builds your technology, all the rest of it. So geoeconomic security right at the heart of this new world order. And economic coercion, the tools that you're going to use to achieve your geoeconomic aims. For example, tariffs. For example, we could be thinking about 2010. China was a very early user of, putting a hold on exports of rare earths at that time to Japan, because there was a political spat over a territorial dispute in the Senkaku Islands. So, that's sort of seen as one of the first modern or reuses of economic coercion. You could also be thinking, staying with China again, Australia's experience during COVID, when the Australian government said we need to have an international inquiry into the origins of COVID. China didn't like that, put import restrictions on things like lobsters and wine and all the rest of it. Economic tools to achieve political aims. Another sort of aspect of geoeconomics is new industrial policy, i.e. the government is taking a bigger share within the economy. We're going to put money here so we build up our semiconductor industry, because we can't be reliant on these global supply chains. For example, would be a really good case study of sort of new industrial policy. European Union does it as well. In fact, I did a short paper for the Hinrich Foundation earlier this year looking at Japan's new industrial policy, looking at TSMC's new manufacturing facilities in Kumamoto as one part of it, and Japan itself has another sort of program to build up its own semiconductors there as well. Again, reducing dependence on global supply chains, building it domestically under the umbrella of achieving economic security. Some other aspects, the retreat of democracy, I'll come back to that a little bit later on. I used to do a little bit of work on the democracy index from the Economist Intelligence Unit. And for about the past 10 years, you've seen, the number of countries that are opening up, becoming more democratic, stricter or better, more robust institutions, so on. That's on the decline for the last 10 years or so. The rise of autocratic regimes, the shutting down of the free press here or there or whatever it might be. But politically, again, one of those assumptions of the 1990s, 2000s, you open up, democracy, strong institutions, all of that being challenged. Authoritarian and hybrid regimes are on the rise. And they don't share the idea that, yes, you should open up your economy and let foreign players come in, or you should allow them to buy this part of your economy. Look at Nippon Steel acquiring America Steel recently. That's sort of caught up in all of this. And the erosion of rules and norms, the sort of quick resorts to military use is quite concerning and worrying as well. Or you could be thinking about Mr. Putin sort of rattling the cage and saying, we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons if this happens, this is our red lines. Now, that wouldn't have happened before. So erosion of rules and norms, another feature of this. Security, no surprise, heightened tensions around the world, go all the way from the Baltics through the Middle East, through the Indian subcontinent, through Southeast Asia, up until the North Pole as well. You got this, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of opportunity for mischief. Nuclear proliferation is a big concern and worry. Why is America attacking Iran at the moment? Partly because of this issue around nuclear proliferation, or Iran getting a bomb. But it's also related to the US presence here in Asia. Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, was here 3 weeks ago for the Shangri-La dialogues, saying how, on the front foot, America is here within the region, shoring up its alliances with Japan, South Korea, Philippines. It parks nuclear power stations, aircraft carriers down at Changi, a naval base, for example. But then 2 weeks later, the Pentagon announced that they were reviewing the AUKUS arrangement, whereby the United States, the UK, and Australia all work together to provide nuclear power advanced submarines for Australia. That's seen as really worrying. And if you were Japan and you saw America say, you know what, we're out of Asia, we're moving back to Hawaii, then you would pretty quickly have a debate around getting nuclear weapons. 60–70% of the Korean population in a foreign affairs essay earlier this year in a poll there was suggesting that they support South Korea getting nuclear weapons because they don't believe that the United States have their back. And then think if you're in Taiwan or in the Philippines or elsewhere. So nuclear proliferation in this part of the world is a really big worry. And the risk of proxy wars. Yes, we're seeing them, plenty of them, sort of, sparking up all over the place. This is not good. Economic, what's this mean for economy? Well, fragmented globalization, those smooth-moving supply chains, the just-in-time, those fantastic documentaries where you could see how an iPhone is built and, everything comes together. If you've ever visited a factory, I went to the BMW factory in the UK where they make the Mini. It's amazing. You go on the production line, there's a part where this line comes in from outside. It's the wiring harness, all the wires and stuff that go in a car. Each car is different. Each wiring harness is different. It comes from Hungary. It comes all the way over Europe, or used to, that was before Brexit, and then joins up with the car at that specific point in time. And I asked the production manager, what happens when it gets wrong? He said, well, we charge them about $10,000 a minute for every time that the production line is stopped. So it doesn't go wrong. Well, that's globalization. That's efficient supply chains. These things are increasingly less efficient and more focused around resilience, having multiple suppliers rather than just one that's really good at it, for example. So fragmented globalization, competing economic blocks. We're moving away from that multilateral system where everybody's sort of invested and looks to benefit to, what can my country get, or what can my bloc get with this, and how can they come together and compete? That's something that we'll see more of. Regionalism is a term I think you'll hear more and more of as well. And all of this puts a dampener on global growth. This year, most forecasters have downgraded their outlook for global GDP because of trade friction, because of fragmented globalization, because of tariffs, because of tensions, because of the politicization of business, the bifurcation of technology. All these things put a dampener on global growth, which means that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who will remain in poverty because they're not going to benefit from access to the global economy at the type of pace that they have done before. They won't be lifted out of poverty. They won't have the money to spend on healthcare and education and so on. And when you see the massive increase in defense spendings taking place around the world, that's an economic choice. You can spend it here or you can spend it there. So that less money available for things like infrastructure and providing the capability to promote digital trade because it's going on tanks or warships or whatever. So anyway, slower growth. And technology, I think I mentioned a couple of phrases there. Techno-nationalism, we'll come back to in a moment. Bifurcation, parallel worlds, we're seeing this emerge. So, starting off with where we were with globalization, moving on to where we're sort of heading. And just to sort of summarize all of that for you, so this top level, really going back to 1945, but more importantly, 1990 onward, and just sort of summarizing some of that. And what I think from 2008 onwards, from that global financial crisis, and then we had the pandemic as well, and Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. We're in this sort of new period here. All right, I'll share all these slides with you as well, so please don't feel the need to scribble it down. Let's move on then. So I've got about 10 minutes, I think, just to sort of go from that global context to the regional dynamics. How is this emerging new world order, these new contours of globalization, how are they touching down here in this part of the world? Because let's be clear, Asia is the part of the world that's benefited most from globalization. I already mentioned, Japan's economic miracle, as it was termed, but everybody else that's followed that, and that's happening now with India as well, premised on access to markets overseas, particularly that export-orientated model that we've seen deliver such success in places like Vietnam. Very, very strong growth, a lot of that premised on making stuff to sell to the United States, to Europe. Factory jobs, low-skilled, semi-skilled, higher-skilled, white-collar, service jobs, all of these emerge through access to trade and investment. So let's sort of focus on Indo-Pacific and go through some of these things like geopolitics and geo-economics and see how they touch down here. Just to sort of have that map in mind about who the sort of key actors are within the region. This is from the FES, the German think tank based in Bangkok, I think it is. A really nice map that they've got there. Looking at who the key actors are and some of the sort of key issues. You've got this blue line here. These are the so-called first and second island chain. America is front and center in the first island chain in terms of, and it sees itself as they're supporting the regional political economy, openness, free trade and all the rest of it. Seen from Beijing, on the other hand, this is seen as a barrier, something that's constricting Chinese growth, and they want to break it. They want to push Americans out of the first island chain, hopefully back to the second island chain, which is Guam, and so on. So, that's one of the sort of key security issues that we've got in Asia. If you look at these red lines, that's looking at how China has linked itself into the global economy. You'll be familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative and the digital Belt and Road and all the rest of it. So building out the infrastructure. And if you look at the trading relations of, vast majority of countries around the world now, China has become the biggest trading partner. Their links with the global south are much stronger than we've got with the United States, for example. And you've got this big sort of Eurasian landmass with Russia in there. We know all about Russia at the moment and that relationship with China. Where does India sit within all of this? A really interesting case study to look at. India's big enough to do what it wants. It's buying record levels of oil from Russia, which is sanctioned by a big part of the world, refining it and selling it to Europe and so on. But at the same time, it's very, very friendly with the United States. Modi and Trump seem to get on quite well. European Union is looking to negotiate an FTA with India and so on. It can do that because it's independent and it's big enough, strong enough, and growing at a fast enough rate to be able to take its own independent course. Everybody else, to greater or lesser degrees, has to sort of work out where they're going. Real issue here in Singapore, you hear it all the time, don't make us choose. Don't make us choose between China, our big brother, our major trading partner and all the rest of it, and the United States, our other big brother as well. And this has been going on for years, of course, but I think the space for some of those political actors to say, no, we're going to sort of be in the middle, we won't have to choose, I think that's diminishing on a daily basis, and particularly when you look at issues around trade and technology and security as well. Let's have a look at some other flashpoints then, keeping with security. Just talking about India, Pakistan, which flared up recently, but India, China, border disputes there that sometimes flare up and come down. Myanmar, of course, an awful bloody civil war going on there as well. It's an ASEAN member state. But then as you get into this part of the world, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and of course, the North Korean peninsula as well, no shortage of flashpoints in this part of the world to tip us from tensions into something a little bit nastier. And just to bring it a bit more focus here, this is a sort of map of the South China Sea, the so-called 9-dash line. I'd be really keeping my eye on what's going on here with the Philippines as well, because that's really quite brutal and nasty. People getting hurt and injured. Someone will get killed at some point if it continues like this. And the Philippines has a security arrangement with the United States, which, would they honor that or not? Who knows? That's one of the big sort of questions. But that actually, I think, is more of a flashpoint than Taiwan. Taiwan is a known point. We know what China wants to do. They've rehearsed embargoes around the island and so on. What would happen in that situation? And then this sort of emerging area as well, this is looking at the North Pole and sort of related to global warming. As these sea routes become viable, who's going to have control over this area? Who's going to be setting the rules of the road? Russia's been making a big play there. China describes itself as a near Arctic power, so they want, to have a role within all of this as well, because this cuts down, container shipping times into Europe and vice versa. I'm going to give about 5 minutes, Kevin, if that's okay, just to sort of quickly go through some of these. I think I'll skip over the political and come on to geoeconomics and trade. Some of you will be familiar with this chart. It's quite a famous one, and there's some issues with it. But essentially, what you're looking at here is China and US trade, the US versus China. So who's the biggest partner for each country? And where you see the blue countries, their biggest trading partner was the United States, it's 2020, right? And there's China there with a few sort of trading partners in Africa and the Middle East. And then jump forward to 2024, the map has gone red. That massive juggernaut of the manufacturing-based Chinese economy has just blown competition out of the water. It continues on a daily basis around the world as well. This is something that gets a lot of people worried, not just President Trump, but in this part of the world, in Japan, in the European Union, and so on. I think what distinguishes what the type of policies that we're seeing from America at the moment is that rather than trying to work them out with partners and have a united front and work for the multilateral system and so on, it's much more, we're going to take the action that we want to take because it's all about America first and economic security. Other people can get in line if they want, but we're going to do what we want, what we see is best. Let's just skip over the manufacturing one. Just have a look at the trade deficit, because this is really crucial. And you'll be going into much more depth and detail over the next couple of days on all of that. But just look at this trade in goods, this massive sort of deficit that America has with the rest of the world. And this is what animates and focuses Mr. Trump. He wants to reduce this trade deficit. He wants America to be making more stuff at home. So he's telling everybody to come back to America, invest in America, build new production facilities, and so on. What he often overlooks is this trade surplus in services. And this makes sense, doesn't it? America's a service-based economy. Think about finance, think about Netflix or Google or JP Morgan or whatever, world-beating services right at the top. that are high value added, knowledge intensive parts of the economy. Surely you would really want to be doubling down on building that out and be less worried about this. However, that's a domestic sort of political issue that Mr. Trump has focused on. Why it's so important to this part of the world. So these are the top 10 deficit countries, the countries where the United States is buying more than it sells, and 6 or 7 of them are here in Asia. Of course, China right at the top there, but you've got all the other economies, including Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. Unsurprisingly, these are all the countries that have been facing the sort of full blast of the tariff regime that we saw announced on April 2nd. And just think about how important all of that is to their economies. This is looking at how important is, looking at the right-hand chart, how important is US demand to Asian economies. And right at the top there, we've got Vietnam, and this chart is suggesting that just under 14% of GDP is in some way dependent on trade with the United States. So it's really, really material to Vietnam's continued economic growth and well-being that they sort out whatever the trading relationship is going to be with the United States. Because if they're slammed with a 46, I think it is, % tariff rate on anything that's made there and goes to America, you know, that's going to significantly retard their growth. It's going to mean that companies will move out and they'll try to relocate somewhere else. So you'll hear a lot about, you know, supply chains moving around the world and so on. But you go all the way down. Singapore's a bit of an outlier because, you know, trade is so important. So it's a trading hub. But for those places that make stuff that's premised on the multilateral system and going overseas, they're really, really exposed. The chart on the left is looking at, you know, the severity of the tariff regime. So where you've got that dark red there, you know, that's over 40%. Now, is it going to happen? We don't know. And this is one of the problems. You know, the big word around the world today is uncertainty. We simply do not know what the outcome of this tariff so-called negotiations are going to be. Is it 10% for pretty much everybody? Is it, you know, 30% for steel, or is it 70%? And the reason you really focus on that, because the multinationals, the people with those supply chains and so on, are collectively holding their breath and waiting for some clarity. They're not going to make that new investment in that chemical plant in Indonesia or that distribution center in Malaysia until they get a better understanding of what the tariff regime is. So you hear this all the time. People holding back on their capex, their capital expenditure, and other budgets and so on. The global economy slows down. And then finally, just a sort of quick thought on technology as well, because technology is right at the heart of all these tensions. It's right at the heart of the new economy, of digital economies. Who has ownership of these next generation technologies is perhaps the crucial question. Who's going to have dominance? Who's going to set the rules of the road for AI and so on? So the foundation has been doing a lot of work on this. There's a lot of great papers that you can find online, not least Alex Capri's book called Techno-Nationalism, which the foundation supported, which looks into these very sort of difficult issues. Where are semiconductors going to be built? Who has access to them, and so on? We can also be thinking about things like China Made in 2025, China's official policy to really sort of become the leader in all of these advanced areas. And there's other policies and programs that they have as well. A few years ago, we were talking a lot about Huawei and 5G. You know, big concerns in places like the States and other countries around the world that Huawei is actually too close to the Chinese military, too close to the Chinese state, that they're somehow going to be listening in on your communications, or, you know, you don't want Huawei tech in your telecommunications system. So, you know, very politicized there. Now it's much more around AI. Who's going to be building your AI tech stack? And is it going to be based on NVIDIA chips, and the cutting edge ones that America only wants a very small number of countries to have access to, or is it going to be Chinese? So, you know, again, bifurcation. Countries will have to make decisions on which one they're going for, which will have consequences as well. Okay, I'm just very quickly going to say, don't worry too much, because all of that can be a bit heavy, and you could go sort of screaming, oh my God, the world's falling apart and trade is going to fall off a cliff and all the rest of it. So there's Munch's scream. But I am from the UK, so I would say keep calm and carry on. And this is why it's so important to really get to grips with these issues, to be researching them, to be asking experts, to be thinking about it, because what happens from here on in is going to be crucial to how the global economy unfolds. Just a couple of sort of more positive areas for us to think about. Global trade continues, and let's have a look at some of the big trading agreements that we've got in this part of the world. The CPTPP, hopefully everybody's familiar with that one. You know, this is a big, valuable trading agreement. The United Kingdom has just voted to join, just ratified joining, and other countries are lining up to join it as well. You know, that's really good because these countries are basically saying, look, you know, with all of this mess going on, we still value a rules-based order. We still want to come together. We still want to find ways of trading and of reducing barriers to trade. Another one in this region is RCEP as well. This one here is a different membership. And this is some modeling that BCG did on sort of future trade patterns. In that emerging new world order, you know, how is trade going, you know, where is it going to be based? Who's going to be trading with who? And so on. So they did some really interesting work looking out to 2034, thinking about how those trade corridors might emerge, and the sort of thicker the line there, you know, the deeper that relationship might be. Now, just a caveat: the latest time they ran this was just before Liberation Day on April the 2nd. So it'd be interesting to see how that's impact there. But you could see, for example, this big growth between ASEAN and China. And there's a pros and cons to that, but also ASEAN, the US, and some other parts of the world as well. And actually, you could say opportunity to grow with the European Union, with the Gulf, and with Japan and South Korea. If you look at it over here, that big red line there is, you know, trade between China and the United States directly is falling off a cliff, and that's not going to come back anytime soon. But it will go somewhere else. So if you're in, you know, a supply chain company, or you're in logistics, or you know, manufacturing, or shipping and ports, well, okay, this is going to happen. So, you know, how do we get positioned for all of that as well? And then, you know, that idea that the United States becomes a bit of a fortress, which I think we're seeing. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I'll leave that there for you. But, you know, emerging New World Order is, you know, a new set of rules and assumptions that are sort of coming out, that are informing it. It's still unclear. It will take some time to sort of work itself out. And, you know, there's a range of alternatives. Global war to, you know, everything sort of settles down and we get on a path to economic development, everything in between. But, you know, the crucial thing is we are moving into a new environment where those assumptions and norms and values are changing and therefore are reshaping our global political economy. And this is just some sort of advice I generally put up for people in this area about how to keep up to date, how to be thinking about geopolitics, particularly engaging in sort of scenario thinking and you know, building those scenarios and then working through what does it mean for us? What does it mean for this country, for this sector, and so on, and building that sort of geopolitical muscle that will help you understand. Okay, sorry, I've gone on a bit too far there, but I'm going to stop, pass over to Kevin.
No, the last thing I want to do is shut down Andrew. As you know, he is a fount of information and information that you can use. So I want to open up to questions, and I want you to identify yourself and your news organization, and we have about 10 minutes to throw some rapid fire questions at Andrew. Who's up?
Hello, Andrew.
Yep.
I'm Duc from Vietnam. I work for Tech in Asia. We focus on technology and startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. And my question is the current nationalism policy of the U.S. Will it persist regardless of the party, or if the Democrat regain the White House in the next 3 years, the U.S. will return to the globalization and or the current trend that you the new order, and even the Democrat, they will follow according to you?
Okay, so the best person to pose that question to is Steve Okun, who I think is speaking tomorrow morning. He's deeply imbued in the American political system, and he will be able to answer it in far more depth and detail than I can. Just some top-level thoughts from a non-American observer of all of this. Will things persist? I think so. If you look at some of the policies that Mr. Trump has put in place, there's support from Democrats and elsewhere around this. And I'm not just thinking about China, where there's very clear sort of bipartisan support to the idea that we need to push back against China. The United States needs to decouple from China. But some specific policies you might have heard around this sort of noise around charging Chinese-built ships, what is it, $1 million or something like that, to dock in American ports and so on, and essentially fining people for using Chinese-made ships to ship their goods to America and so on. That again has some bipartisan support within it. And let's not forget that Biden didn't take America into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Hillary Clinton, in the campaign trail, this is back in 2016, said that she wouldn't sign the agreement either. So there's pretty much for the last 10 years been bipartisan agreement that America's not going to sign a big free trade agreement like that as well. Now, for all the other sort of deeper political things about midterms and so on, Steve Oken is your guide tomorrow.
Hello, Andrew. Frank from Thai Public Broadcasting Service. My question is, do you think in coming years, regionalization will finally surpass globalization? As in, of course, we see tariff really expedite the decoupling of connection between Asia, Thailand, and the United States too. And right now, of course, Thailand's government, they really want to seek FTAs with EU and other nations in the region. And that inter-trade also targeted to be boosted in the region, in ASEAN too. So do you think finally regionalization will be more important for than globalization?
So it's a really great question. The title of my PhD was Responses to Regionalism. All right. So I'm very interested in regionalization as a process. So, splitting up your value chain across ASEAN, for example, and regionalism as a more sort of top-down political process. So, building an ASEAN, a European Union, or whatever. Part of that research, and this is going way back, appreciated, but it's relevant. So go back to the 98 Asian financial crisis, which ripped through this part of the world, right? And particularly Thailand, was very badly hit, as was Indonesia and others as well. There was a recognition that we ASEAN we need to accelerate the integration of our markets, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So, that was always sort of out there, and yes, we're working towards it, and we'll all get together and shake our hands in a nice batik shirt and all the rest of it, but it was taking ages and ages and ages. Because of that crisis, it accelerated the application, the implementation of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Fantastic, okay? Crisis causes action. But then you jump forward to today, go and speak to business people about the challenges of moving products, goods, and not even talking about services around ASEAN, supposedly in this free trade agreement. Thailand wants this label, Vietnam wants that label. Malaysia has this safety standard, and Indonesia has this one, and so on and so on. So it actually, these act as brakes on regional economic integration. Intra-regional trade, so trade within among ASEAN economies, has been stuck, I think, around 2% for a number of years. Why isn't that deepening? And there is a massive opportunity now, and we've heard it at the recent ASEAN summits, for ASEAN to come together to look at those barriers to trade, the non-tariff barriers, and so on, and clean house. So just taking sort of ASEAN as a case study, I think there is opportunity there. On the other hand, if you look at the sort of nationalist and protectionist policies that we see across the region, I'm particularly thinking about Indonesia at the moment, then it seems highly unlikely that we'll see anything meaningful come from that. You look at other parts of the world, the whole sort of security situation means that the European Union has absolutely had a bucket of water in the face, and it's had to wake up to how its regional the European market is set up, comes into really clear focus on defense spending. Everybody now is looking to increase their defense spending. Canada, I spoke for the Canadians here in Singapore 2 weeks after Mr. Trump got elected. They had their annual conference here, and I spoke to business leaders. And the sense of anger in the room was white hot at how they've been treated by their friendly neighbor to the south. I mean, all this nonsense about 51st state and so on, just incredibly rude. And Canada, is now really doubling down on its Indo-Pacific strategy. It wants to reduce dependency on the United States and find new markets and opportunities for investment in this part of the world. So at the regional level, at the country level, companies as well, the big mantra is control what you can. You can't control all of this, but you can control where you are in your digital transformation journey and this, that, and the other, do all of that. These are some positives, I think, coming out of the negative sort of crisis that we've seen. Just a final point on regionalism. So I'm reading 1984 again. I read it every few years, George Orwell's 1984, which is all about three consistently competing blocks. East Asia, Eurasia, Oceania. That's a sort of nightmarish vision of the future. But I think a much more benign one is where you get like-minded groups, bodies of countries like the European Union, like ASEAN, and individual countries saying, we're like-minded in the sense that we benefited from an open, transparent, liberal trading economy, and we want to continue that. We want to go deeper around digital trade, for example. So regardless of all of this noise, we're going to talk, we're going to come to some agreements, and we will see much more sort of inter-regional linkages there, I think. European Union, of course, GCC, I think is a very interesting one to keep your eye on, ASEAN, and then more broadly thinking about things like CPTPP as sort of blocks for that to happen.
I'd love to entertain some more questions, but the clock is our enemy here.
Yeah.
And
Apologies for that.
I hate to shut down the conversation, but I think Andrew is going to join us for dinner later. So if you don't mind,
Sure.
getting pelted with questions there
Yep.
while you eat. But we will have to close for questions so we can move on for the evening. But first of all, join me in thanking Andrew for an extraordinary, instructive presentation.